We are up to 2 Samuel chapter 16. 2 Samuel chapter 16. We started last year going through the life of King Saul, and then that has just traveled right on through the book of 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel, and we've been going through verse by verse, and now we're into the life of David, and David is king over Israel. And yet here from the last couple chapters, Absalom has revolted against David. Absalom has proclaimed himself and gotten a band of followers that were willing to proclaim him king. And David, for fear of himself and his family, David has left Jerusalem. From chapters 14 and 15, David has evacuated Jerusalem. Absalom has stolen the hearts of the children of Israel. And folks are now beginning to side up. Right? Who's on what side? Where does everyone's loyalties lie? Now, many lied with Absalom. Again, Absalom stole the hearts of the children of Israel. Absalom kind of prodded people with bitterness about the current administration and how things were going in the nation of Israel, and how if he were in charge or if he were judge in the land, he would hear their case, he would go and plead their cause, and that they would find a friend or an ally in him. He's turned people against David. Now, David has some loyal followers as well, and we saw that there in chapter 15 last week. David has the Cherethites, the Pelethites. He has 600 men that have followed him from Gath, all through his wanderings and all through his time here being king. We've read about Zadok and Abiathar, and they are priests, and they're loyal to David, and they're actually going to go back into Jerusalem and kind of be spies for David. We were introduced to a man named Hushai. Hushai is going to go back to Jerusalem and be a spy for David, because David has found out that Absalom has taken one of his most trusted counselors. Remember that? Ahithophel? Ahithophel is also turned in the conspiracy against David, and Ahithophel is feeding Absalom advice. David sends Hushai back, according to the end of chapter 15, in an attempt, hopefully, to frustrate that advice. And he wants a spy. He wants someone that's loyal to him, kind of on the inside. And so chapter 15 ends. Of course, David is still anxious, still worried. Absalom is on the verge of taking complete control of Jerusalem. But David's starting to formulate a plan. Send Zadok, send Abiathar, send Hushai back. Get some folks, get some spies, some people in Jerusalem that are loyal to him, so that they can get him word and they can frustrate the other advice. Tonight in chapter 16, more unfolds as more folks proclaim or side up, as maybe we would say. We're going to see some deception and depravity against David, okay? Deception and depravity against David. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse number 1. It says, "And when David was a little past the top of the hill, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of asses saddled, and upon them 200 loaves of bread and 100 bunches of raisins, 100 of summer fruits, and a bottle of wine. And the king said unto Ziba, What meanest thou by these? And Ziba said, The asses be for the king's household to ride on, and the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine that such as be faint in the wilderness may drink." Number one, Ziba's lies. Okay, Ziba's lies, Ziba's deception. Now you read verse number 1 and verse 2, and you read about Ziba, who is, according to this verse, the servant of Mephibosheth. You guys remember that name, Mephibosheth? He was talked about a few chapters back. He was one of the last remaining ones, descendants of King Saul. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan. He was the one, remember, the one that was crippled from the time he was a young man, and David elevated him. David brought him into the royal palace. David brought him into his home because he wanted to show kindness to the house of Saul for Jonathan's sake. Jonathan was David's best friend. They were loyal and faithful to each other. They had encouraged each other. They were friendly for years and years. Even when Saul turned against David, Jonathan didn't, and he had a friend even on the inside. Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son, and David showed him great kindness, fed him, brought him into his home, promised to do him well. And Mephibosheth apparently here has a servant named Ziba. And according to verse number 1 and 2, this servant Ziba, at a time of great need for David, he brought a bunch of essential supplies. It talks about him bringing asses, donkeys to him, loaves of bread, bunches of raisins, summer fruits, a bottle of wine. And when David says, "What's up? What's going on with these? What do you mean by these?" in verse 2, Ziba said, "Well, these are for the king's family to ride on, and the food's for the young men to eat, and the wine's for those that are faint to drink." This is like a super nice gesture, right? This is incredibly kind gesture that Ziba would bring all of these supplies to David after he's evacuated Jerusalem. He's kind of anxious, he's fearful, he's a little worried about his household, about his family, about what's going to become of things with Absalom. This seems to be like a really, really kind gesture, right? At a time of great need, Ziba brings him these items. That's really nice, right? You say, why do you say it that way? You almost make it sound like there's a catch. Because there's a catch. Verse number 3. And the king said, "Where is thy master's son?" Where is Mephibosheth? Where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, "Behold, he abideth at Jerusalem, for he said, Today shall the house of Israel restore me the kingdom of my father." When David asks about Mephibosheth, Ziba tells him this story that he didn't come. He stayed behind in Jerusalem, and it sounds like he's actually looking forward to being returned to glory, being restored to power. Now, what does that mean? Is Ziba saying, that Mephibosheth assumes that this is going to fall out between you two, and as the ugliness rears its head and both of you fall out of favor, guess what's going to happen? Saul's family is once again going to be restored to honor in the kingdom in Israel, in Jerusalem, and he's just kind of biding his time. He said he wasn't coming. He was going to wait, according to verse number 3, saying, "Today shall the house of Israel restore me the kingdom of my father." Now, there's only one problem with that. Mephibosheth never said that. He's lying. Ziba's lying. You actually find that out later on, and we'll get there in a couple of weeks. It'll take us a little bit to get there, but in chapter number 19, you find out that Ziba had actually deceived Mephibosheth too. Ziba had deceived Mephibosheth into taking these animals and these supplies so that he could use them for his own purpose. Ziba left Mephibosheth behind so that he could make it look like he didn't support David. So he comes with all these gifts, he comes with these animals, he comes with all of these supplies, he looks really good in David's sight, and he lies about Mephibosheth. That is not what Mephibosheth did, okay? He lied about that. And this probably makes David feel terrible, right? Because what's David do? David's got a limited amount of information right now. This has got to make him feel terrible, though. Another friend. We've already talked about Ahithophel, one of his most trusted counselors, turning on him. And now, what's David to assume? Another friend? And not just a friend, but Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, this one that he has showed such great kindness to, he's turned on him, right? This one that he had shown just great faithfulness to, had risen him up from poverty, brought him into his house, and now Mephibosheth has turned against him too, right? No. But David doesn't know that. And Ziba has come and told this story, and it's not true. Now look at verse number 4. It says, "Then said the king to Ziba, Behold, thine are all that pertained unto Mephibosheth." He's going to give Ziba, the servant, all that was Mephibosheth's. And Ziba said, "I humbly beseech thee that I may find grace in thy sight, my lord, O king." What a terrible guy, right? This is what he wanted. David responds. David says, for your loyalty, for what you have done, I'm going to take and give you all that I gave to Mephibosheth. Now, David was rash there. David assumed the worst, and I get it, right? David's in a tough spot. Absalom, his son, has turned on him. Ahithophel, his most trusted counselor, has turned on him. It doesn't seem to be all that shocking, news maybe. I mean, it's troublesome, it's terrible, but, everything else seems to be falling apart around David, and it seems that he just took it for granted and assumed, yep, why would he lie about that? Why would he say that? And David rashly, just based on the word that comes from Ziba, he believes him, he listens, he acts on that information. And you're going to find out later, that's not what Mephibosheth said. That is not how this played out. Ziba was a deceiver. He had lied here. It seems that Ziba had this plan and this intent to use this tragedy as a means to promote himself. And that is not helpful, and that is not wise for any of us to come into someone's time of trouble, into somebody's tragedy, and use that as a means to promote ourselves. We don't want to come into somebody's trouble, okay, and see, oh, well, no, this is the perfect time. This is the perfect time to take advantage of this situation. This person's vulnerable. This person's weak. This person's in trouble. And listen, some people manipulate, and some people do that. Some people go, when they know that someone's down, when they know that someone's low, when they feel that they can use that to their advantage, don't do that, okay? Don't take advantage of people in their low times like Ziba did here. He lied, he was deceptive, and it seems that his intent was to gain or to earn favor, but he did it in such an underhanded way. Okay? And don't do that. This is not the time. When someone is in trouble and when someone is low, that is not the time for us to come in and use that to our advantage. Okay? Don't be a Ziba. Number 2, let's look at Shimei's cursing. Shimei's cursing. So Ziba's our first character. Now let's talk about Shimei. Verse number 5, and when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. So he's from the family of Saul as well, right? These guys, these long-lost relatives of Saul, now that David's in trouble, these guys are starting to come out of the woodwork. In verse number 6, it says that he cast stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. Here comes Shimei, and as this, whatever relation he was to Saul, he just can't help but rejoice at the thought that David is in trouble now. Now, I would say this is akin to the last lesson, right? Not only should you not be a Ziba and come in and use someone else's tragedy or trouble to your advantage, it's also not the time to come in rejoicing. It's not the time to come in celebrating. And he just seems so happy at the thought that David is now in this trouble, and he comes along cursing. He comes along throwing stones at David and David's followers. And listen to the things that he's saying. He's basically telling David, getting what you deserve, old boy. You're getting remember how you treated Saul? Remember how you underhanded you were? Remember how you stole the kingdom from Saul? God got you, didn't he? God's judgment's falling upon you. God's getting you back for all the things you've done. You're nothing. What does he call him? He calls him a bloody man. You're nothing but a bloodthirsty, traitorous rebel. He says in verse 8, thou art taken in thy mischief. You got what was coming to you, and you deserved it. Like he's just spouting off these curses, these hateful things that he's saying. He's throwing rocks at David and his people? Now, first of all, none of this is right. Was David underhanded to Saul? Not at all, right? David actually did Saul right. Even when Saul was in the wrong, David never retaliated against Saul, even when he had opportunities, right? We talked about a couple of opportunities. Saul was in the cave. David could have killed him. Saul was camped out, and his men, his generals, had let their guard down, and David and his crew could just run right through the camp. He didn't attack him. He didn't kill him there. David had opportunities to take vengeance upon Saul, and he didn't do it. David prayed for Saul. David, wept. David gave that great eulogy at the end of Saul's life. David did Saul right. When Shimei curses him here in this passage, and he talks about the Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul. David didn't kill Saul. David wasn't responsible for what happened to Saul and those things. That's not true. He's also wrong when he says that David was bloodthirsty. Now, the Bible does tell us that David was a man of war, but he's not a bloodthirsty savage. David did execute war against the Philistines, and David did execute war against Syrians and against the enemies of Israel and the enemies of God. He's not called a bloodthirsty man, though. Yes, his character and his nature as a man of war and for the wars that he fought, we talked about that, right? That was one of the reasons that God said he would not be allowed to build the temple. He would actually have it built by a more peaceful man. It was going to be built during the time of Solomon. But people have misunderstood that. When God tells David that he's not able to build the temple because he was a man of war, God's not rebuking David. God just doesn't want it built on the back of blood. He doesn't want the temple built on the back of war. God's not rebuking David for the wars that he fought against Israel's enemies. David's not a bloodthirsty savage. So Shimei's wrong in that too. Saul's ruin was not David's fault. I get it. It's self-serving. Shimei is from the family or from the house of Saul. And the way that played out, that Saul was killed and David immediately became king, and how even during Saul's life, people began to follow after David. Saul killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. Saul, was able to see that David became a hero to the children of Israel. That set some people, I'm sure that set Saul's family off, and they didn't like that. But a lot of these things that he's saying here are not true. Now, it may be that what's happening, let me say this, what happened with Absalom may have been, to a degree, God's judgment upon David. David had committed some sins, and God told David that because of those sins, that the sword would never leave his house, that his children were destined to the things that we're starting to see play out. What is happening with Absalom, yes, may be in a very real sense part of God's judgment upon David. But it's not why Shimei said. It doesn't have anything to do with Saul. It doesn't have anything to do with David being a traitor. It doesn't have anything to do with David being underhanded to Saul. It doesn't have anything to do with him stealing the kingdom from Saul. These are bitter words from a bitter person, and he's cursing and he's lying about David. And so in verse number 9, then said Abishai, and you remember the sons of Zeruiah, Joab, and Abishai, they're loyal to David. Now, they're loyal to their own cause at the same time, but they are fiercely patriotic, and they've been thus far loyal to their king. And so in verse number 9, then said Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, unto the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. You insult my king. You insulted my king. Those are fighting words. He's ready to just end it. He's ready to end Shimei, kill him right then and there. Kind of reminds you, like the sons of thunder, right? Let's do something about this right now, right here and now. David takes a different approach. Verse 10, the king said, "What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah?" And just in him saying that, he's actually proving that he wasn't bloodthirsty, right? When Shimei talks about him being a bloody man, you're nothing but a bloodthirsty hypocrite. And Abishai is going to say, well, can we kill him? Can we please kill him? And David says no. And he basically proves he's not the bloodthirsty killer. He's not the bloodthirsty savage he was just accused of being. "What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? Let him curse. Because the Lord hath said unto him, Curse David. Who shall then say, Wherefore hast thou done so?" Not only does David prove that he's not a bloodthirsty killer, he's able to contemplate in the moment, maybe this is God's providence. And maybe God's hand is in it. And maybe this message comes from the Lord. And though Shimei is not off the hook for the way that he's doing it, he's still responsible for the manner and way in which he says these things and says them in bitterness and hatefulness and in cursing, and half of it's a lie. But David calmly contemplates, maybe God's hand is in it. And being able to see that, right, that's hard. That's difficult to do, to see even in troublesome times, even in the midst of a terrible situation, trying to consider, is God's hand in this, right? Can I find God's providence? Is there something that God's trying to say? Is there something that God's trying to do in this? Let him curse. It very well could be God's saying something. God's trying to get my attention, or maybe the Lord's hand is in it. Not only that, verse number 11, David puts a unique perspective. David never lost perspective. Verse 11, he says, David said to Abishai and to all of his servants, "Behold, my son, which came forth of my bowels, seeketh my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do it?" David realized, my son is trying to kill me. I'm not worried about this guy. I'm not worried about this Benjamite. If my son that came from my own bowels has stolen the loyalty of Israel, and he's going to come after me with the full force, and my own son is trying to kill me, I'm not worried about this guy. That's perspective, right? He realized that his real problem was Absalom. David could see the big picture. That's hard for us, right? That's hard for us in times of trouble. When we're worried or when we're anxious, it's hard for us to see God's providence, perhaps. And sometimes it's really hard for us to see the big picture. Don't get distracted. David's not going to get distracted by every little distraction, by every little circumstance. Yes, Shimei is a jerk, and this is terrible language that he's using, and he's lying, and he's offending everyone, and David's men want to rally and cut his head off. David's like, nope. I can see the big picture, right? The big picture. Don't lose focus because of every little distraction. And David seems to grasp that, right? Those things that sometimes are difficult for us. Seeing God's hand, his providence, seeing the big picture, right? Having that greater perspective. David grasped that. Let him alone, it says in verse 11, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. Wise words from David. There are many that would say David could be justified if he had cut his head off, because Shimei was wrong. And he's not supposed to, according to the law and according to the custom and the way that things were. Cursing the king, you might get your head cut off. And this could be considered treason and all those things. David, no. We got bigger fish to fry. There's something bigger to worry about. We're not going to get distracted with every little thing when there's a bigger thing at play here. So David was able to see that. Verse number 12, it may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. David realized that if he took a humble acceptance of what God was sending him, maybe this, David said it, maybe this is coming from the Lord. It doesn't excuse Shimei for the way that he's doing it and for the things that he said, but if there's a word of rebuke that needs to come from the Lord, David knows that if I humbly accept it, if we just receive it, it very well could be that the Lord would reward him with good. In those times, right? In those times of correction maybe from the Lord, or where we need to see the Lord's hand and his providence, humbly accepting rebuke or correction. Again, we're not excusing the way that Shimei brought it. We're not excusing the things that he said. But David's trying to see the big picture. And if indeed this came from the Lord, and if I'm willing to just humbly take it, accept it, not act with revenge, it very well could be that the Lord will reward me for that. So David's willing to do so. You know, revenge doesn't always have to be the first thought on our minds. And it didn't seem to be the first thought on David's mind here. And as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along on the hillside over against him and cursed as he went and threw stones at him and cast dust. So there's two things that happen there in verse number 13. Shimei continues doing it. But David and his men also, they just keep going, right? David and his men, they went by the way. And sometimes that's all you can do, is just keep going, right? And that doesn't mean that it's going to stop. It apparently doesn't mean that Shimei is going to stop right away. David puts his head down, plows forward, keeps going, okay? That is evidence that David meant what he said about perspective and not getting distracted, keeping the big picture in mind, keeping focus. If this is from the Lord, humbly accept it. Let's keep going. And here comes Shimei. He's going to keep going for a while, keep cursing, keep throwing, but they're just going to press on, okay? Just keep pressing on. And if those things happen, that's an encouragement for us to do the same. And the king and all the people that were with him came, weary, and refreshed themselves there. David was not alone. David was not without help. He was not without comfort. It's encouraging to know that despite all that David was going through, he was able to be brought to this place of refreshing and peace in spite of all those circumstances. And God's people can have that, okay? When we talk about times of refreshing or times of peace, that doesn't mean that the turmoil, doesn't mean that the tragedy or the circumstance goes away. The thing with Absalom's still real. It's still happening. And yet David could find periodic times of peace, refreshing, help, and comfort when he needed them. Number 3, Hushai and Ahithophel. Hushai and Ahithophel. Verse number 15, it says that Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. Came to pass when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, was coming to Absalom, that Hushai said unto Absalom, God save the king, God save the king. So it's real now, right? Things are getting real. We've trailed David through the wilderness a little bit. We've seen some stories there with him in the first part of chapter 16. But back in Jerusalem, things are getting real. Absalom has come into the city of Jerusalem. He's not at Hebron anymore. He's in the capital. And he has got a crew. It says there, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. He's got an entourage, and he's got mighty men, and he's got counselors, and he's got some that were previously loyal to David. Things are cooking. Things are heating up, right? He has come into his father's city, the capital that David had built. And here comes our guy, Hushai. Now, you remember Hushai in the last chapter proclaimed his loyalty to David, proclaimed that his faithfulness to David. And David knew, I can use that. And he sent Hushai back to Jerusalem to be a spy for him, to thwart and to frustrate the counsel of Ahithophel. So in verse number 16, notice what it says, that Hushai said, God save the king, God save the king. You remember how Ziba deceived Mephibosheth and David? Well, guess what? Hushai is working the other side. He's going to deceive Absalom. Hushai is working for David. Okay? He's on David's side here. God save the king. He's going to proclaim loyalty to Absalom, but in his heart, he's still got a loyalty for David. Now in verse 17, Absalom said to Hushai, is this thy kindness to thy friend? Why wentest thou not with thy friend? Oh, Where's David? This, kind words that you've got for me. What about your previous friend? What about the one you used to show loyalty to? And he said in verse 18, Hushai said to Absalom, Nay, but whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel choose, his will I be, and with him will I abide. So when Absalom says, Hushai, where's your loyalty? I thought you were loyal to your friend. What about David? Hushai's answer is basically, I'm loyal to the king. Whoever the king is, my loyalties are with the highest bidder, right? I'll be loyal to whoever the king is. And it looks like, right now, it's Absalom, right? Absalom's been proclaimed king at Hebron. He's now brought into the city of Jerusalem. He's got the entourage. He's got the counselors. He's got the men. He's got the faithfulness and loyalty. God save the king. I'll be loyal to you. Verse 19, he says it again and again. Whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in thy father's presence, so will I be in thy presence. I'll be as loyal to you as I was to your father. I'm loyal to whoever the king is. Right? Wink, wink. Right? You and I know. All right. He's laying it on thick, right? He's saying the right words. He's saying the right words. Verse number 20, Then said Absalom to Ahithophel, Give counsel among you what we shall do. He's in the city now, right? Absalom has come into his father's city. He wants advice. What do we do next? What should we do? How does Absalom end this? Or how does he take it to the next level? How does he get the rest of the country? What do we do next? How do I cement my place? How do I cement my standing? Ahithophel, what you got, man? What do you think? Verse 21, Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. When Absalom asks Ahithophel, what should I do next? How do I end this? How do I cement my legacy? How do I cement my place here as king? Ahithophel's advice is this. It is to do something so disgusting, so irreverent, and so offensive that it becomes obvious that there's no going back after this. You see, there may still be this lingering in the heart of David, and maybe even in the hearts of other people in Israel. It hasn't gone too far yet, right? It's not gotten so far out of hand that they can't reconcile, right? It can't be so far that maybe they can still work things out. Maybe they can make amends. Maybe we can figure this out. Ahithophel's advice is you take that thought and you put an end to it. You do something that is according to verse number 21, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. You do something that's going to make it evident that it's over. There is no reconciliation. There is no going back. It's me. There's no more David. There's no more David and Absalom. There's no reconciliation. You end it. And his advice to him, the way to do that, was to go into David's concubines. You remember from last week or a couple weeks ago when David fled, when David evacuated Jerusalem in a hurry, he left a handful of his concubines behind to watch over the house, to take care of things. Ahithophel's advice is, you go in unto them in verse 21. Go into thy father's concubines, which he hath left. And when you go into them, and you sleep with them, and you defile them in front of all of Israel, then they'll know. Now, again, Ahithophel knows a couple of things. First of all, there's no going back from this. There is no reconciliation after this. This is a disgusting and a vile, irreverent, and offensive deed. There's no reconciling after this. This is a way for Absalom to totally repudiate and humiliate his father, right? In a sense, it's also kind of self-serving. Now, Ahithophel if no one else, but Ahithophel has a lot to lose if David and Absalom ever do reconcile, right? Because Ahithophel is traitor number one. Ahithophel is on the chopping block. If something ever works out, if there's ever any repentance or any degree of compassion, if David and Absalom ever work this thing out, Ahithophel has a lot to lose. So Ahithophel's suggestion is to do something so vile that it ensures that won't happen. And according to verse 22, so they spread Absalom a tent upon the top of the house, and Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of Israel. Absalom did what he suggested. Now, there's a reason that's given for why he did. According to verse 23, the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel with both David and with Absalom. Now, don't misunderstand that. That does not mean that the advice that he just gave was good advice, was wise advice, was godly advice. This was vile advice. But Absalom listened because Ahithophel had a reputation. He had a testimony that this guy gives great advice. He gives wise advice. When you ask Ahithophel, it's like stopping just short of praying about it and asking the Lord about it. Like, Ahithophel had a great reputation as a wise counselor that gave good, sound advice. And knowing that, Absalom jumped right at this. Now listen again. This was destructive advice. This was not good advice. This was not wise advice. It's good advice if you want to destroy Israel. It's good advice if you want to destroy any hope of reconciliation between David and Absalom, which absolutely Ahithophel would have wanted. Why would he suggest that? Some say that Ahithophel may have wanted revenge on David. We've talked about it before, right? If you compare a couple of scriptures, it looks like there's sufficient and strong argument that maybe Bathsheba was granddaughter to Ahithophel. And this may be his long-awaited way to get revenge against David for what he had done to Bathsheba. You humiliate my granddaughter? Well, guess what? I'm going to take your women. Take your women and make sure that they're defiled. I'm going to take your women and we'll make sure that they get, some similar kind of treatment. That's the power of bitterness, right? Ahithophel's willing to put others through suffering so that he can have his own little degree maybe of revenge against David, if that's what this is all about. That's just terrible, right? Bitterness is ugly when it rears its head, right? If you think that bitterness is okay to let fester and let linger and that it'll never mean much, it'll never get that bad, it can get that bad. Like this is ugly. This is also a fulfillment of God's promise. Back in chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 12 and verse number 11, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house. And I will take thy wives before thine eyes and give them unto thy neighbor. And he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." One of the punishments, one of the judgments that came upon David for what he had done with Bathsheba was that someone would do that to his family. And they wouldn't do it secretly. They would do it openly. They would do it publicly. And that's what happens with Absalom. Absalom publicly and openly, according to our text, it says that they took a tent and they spread it up on top of the house. And Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in all the sight of Israel. And there, where everyone could see, Absalom destroyed any hope of reconciliation, any thought that maybe it hasn't gone too far yet. Maybe maybe it hasn't gone over the edge. It's over the edge now. And now when chapter 16 ends, we got a bad situation, right? David's started his side. He's got his spies. He's got his he's got his followers. And David's ever cautious and plotting and waiting. Absalom, though, has full-blown opened his rebellion. And he has stolen not just the hearts of the men of Israel, he has physically taken the concubines, the women of his father. There's no going back after this. Okay? All of the sorrow that we had talked about in David's heart, it was real. And he hated how that things had fallen out and how that things had worked out with Absalom. But when you get to the end of chapter 16, there's no going back now. This is full blown, and it's getting ready to get real. Now we'll get into chapter number 17 next week as we start to get into some conflicting advice. Remember, Hushai has been left in Jerusalem to kind of give his advice to counteract and to frustrate the advice of Ahithophel. We're going to start to see some of that next week. David's attitude, right? David's attitude in the midst of his trouble has given us some great, great encouragement. Try to see God's hand in it. Try to see the big picture. Try to keep perspective. If God's hand is in it, try, if we can, learn to humbly accept. God may reward us. Keep that perspective. Keep that good attitude. And then on the other side, boy, with Ahithophel and with Absalom, bitterness, when it springs and when it rears its ugly head. We know why Absalom is bitter. He's bitter against his father for making him an exile, for not doing anything about what happened with his sister. He's bitter. It's very likely that Ahithophel is bitter against David for the things that he has done. And the more bitter they get, the uglier their lives get, the uglier the decisions they make. So again, don't let that stuff linger. Don't let that stuff fester, because when it comes out, it's super ugly. Okay? God help us.